Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel where today we are doing a full-length, non-spoilery review of the Firebird Trilogy by CLaudia Gray. And yes, I do only own the first two books in physical copy. The Firebird Trilogy is a young adult science fiction trilogy that follows our main character of Marguerite. Marguerite is the daughter of two physicists who have invented this device called the Firebird. And the Firebird allows your consciousness to travel to other dimensions, provided that you were born in that dimension and that you're still alive in that dimension. Because what ends up happening is your consciousness travels into your body in that dimension and you kind of like pilot it around while you're there. As we open up on the first book, Marguerite's dad has been killed and his grad student has been blamed, and this grad student has grabbed the Firebird and traveled to a different dimension and thereby avoiding justice in Marguerite's world. And Marguerite decides that that cannot stand, so she grabs the other Firebird and goes after him. And then obviously it goes from there. So first up, let's talk about the world building. So the world building is really interesting. Obviously, we're going to different dimensions. We get to see these really cool worlds that are similar to, some of them are very similar to ours with just slightly different things, and some of them are just clearly the difference between our world and their world is like this big massive choice that had lasting impact kind of thing. So there's some that are very similar and there's some that are very much not. But it is, and so it's very interesting to go travel to these places and see it. And I do think that CLaudia Gray did a good job picking out the details that we would need to move the story and the plot along, but also like the details we would need so that we would have enough information that we could kind of fill in the gaps a little bit at least. And I do think she did a good job on that. However, we didn't spend nearly enough time in these worlds. And so like you just get the barest snippet. And part of the beauty of going like reading a dimensional travel type story is understanding why their world is so different than yours. So like finding out, oh, like John Wilkes Booth never actually killed Abraham Lincoln, and so things just went completely different, or something like that, whatever it is, right? You want to know why the world is different, but we never actually got that. And so for me, I was just kind of disappointed. I wanted to know more, and it was just kind of very thin. It was very interesting, and I still really appreciated it, but it was just not enough. And then the other thing that I will mention is clearly this is science fiction. There is absolutely no scientific explanation for this Firebird. There's not even an attempt made to explain it. Like it's actually kind of amazing. Like usually you'll get some amount of pseudoscience and there's nothing. There's no explanation because honestly, that's not the point, right? So and I actually do agree with this choice that the author made to not put any kind of scientific explanation in. And that's because like as soon as you start putting science in, there's always going to be those that like debate the science, but by not putting any science in, you're really focusing the reader on the plot and the themes and the characters. And I do think that in this case that was the right choice. The whole not explaining the science is helped by the fact that Marguerite is an art student. And so sometimes she'll hand wave and be like, I'm an art person, I'm not a scientist, so I don't even understand all this, which I don't like that one. But sometimes she's also just like, oh my gosh, I hear science all the time at my dinner table. Can we talk about literally anything else? Which I'm like, that's a much more believable explanation. I accept that one. And so like, there was at least reasons why it was the science of it wasn't discussed, but like I said, I do think that's the right choice. So next, let's talk about the plot. Now, obviously, I don't want to spoil anything, and so I will talk very generally about the plot. But essentially, this does follow your very typical young adult trilogy structure in that the first book we are dealing with a very specific kind of small problem in our protagonist's life. And somewhere in like the last third to a quarter of that first book, they find out, oh, this is like a bigger conspiracy than I knew. The second book is really an exploration of just how big this conspiracy is. And then the third book is we have to solve this because literally the world is at stake, or the multiverse in this case. It very much follows that, and I actually do think it was done pretty well. Like, obviously, because I recognized the structure, I kind of knew where we were headed, but I still think it was done pretty well. Like, it wasn't, it just kind of flowed much more naturally than a lot of young adult trilogies do. And so, like, we never got that like evil speech of evil from the villain who's just like, but you don't really understand just how amazing my plot is, and then just doesn't tell them anything. It's actually like our villain is not completely dumb like that, and so they have to figure it out more on their own. And it's interesting to watch them do it. And so I did find that really interesting. The plot is also at least in the first two books, is twisty, turny enough that I didn't always know where we were going to end up, and that was really, really fun. Now, the third book does fall into more predictable territory, especially the ending. So, like, there were definitely things where I looked at it and I'm like, oh, well, that's going to be important for later, and then, of course, it was. And the ending was a little bit cleaner than I would have otherwise liked, but generally speaking, I still think it was a solid ending, a solid third book, even if I didn't love it as much as I loved the previous two books. So next, let's talk about characters. So this is actually a really interesting book in that there are basically like 8 core characters throughout the books. I mean, there's other like one-off things that like people who move the plot forward, but for the most part, like we really focus on these 8 characters, and it's Marguerite, her parents Henry and Sophia, her sister Josie, the grad students Theo and Paul, Wyatt Conley, and this random person named Romola. I don't know how to pronounce her name, so that's interesting. But generally speaking, like it's those 8 characters, and in the first book we spent a lot more time getting to know those characters. And then towards the end of that first book and into this next book, like we know our version of these characters, and then we start to get to know the alternate dimension versions of these characters, which is actually really cool because that's where we start seeing, oh, like this person, our Theo, for example, is different than their Theo because of this one choice that was made early on in his life. Or like for one of the Marguerites, like she had meningitis when she was young, but in her world it worked out, it was fine. But in another world, like the medicines didn't work quite as quickly, or like her parents didn't get her to the doctor quick enough, or something happened. So she is actually deaf, and which is a side effect, or can be a side effect of meningitis. And so it's just like you get to see those different little things that have such a huge impact on your life. And that's, I think, really, really interesting. And for most of these characters, we do get to know a couple different we get to know a couple different Marguerites, we get to know a couple different Theos, for example. And it is really interesting to see how they differ. And honestly, like having like variations on a character, essentially, like because like we have this version, our version of Theo, and then we have like alternate version of Theo number 1 and alternate version of Theo number 2, whatever. It kind of makes it feel like it has a very full cast of characters, and I just found that really, really interesting. Speaking specifically about our main character of Marguerite, I do actually like Marguerite, which may be a surprise if you saw any of my reading vlogs about these books. But essentially, like, Marguerite's 18, and she definitely has some naive thoughts about the world. However, one of the things I really appreciate about these books is that she's always checked on those naive beliefs. Like, the naive beliefs, like, she's 18, right? So she just doesn't have enough life experience to know that, like, yeah, okay, sometimes it works out like that, but 99% of the time it does not. So as an adult, you're just like, oh, please don't, like, bank on that happening. But she's young and she just doesn't have that life experience, right? And then, but the thing I like, and this is very normal for young adult, right? But in most young adult novels that I've read, our main character has like their naive thought, and then the plot happens and they realize, and it's basically a check on that naive thought, and they're like, oh, I guess that's not how the world works. But it always comes from the plot. And in this series, it actually comes from other characters. And I really, really like that. There's like one character who pulls Marguerite aside and is just like, honey, you are being a gigantic hypocrite and maybe you should cut it out. And I really just, and sometimes even Marguerite does it for herself. Like there's this storyline that we're going down and she's trying to convince another character of something. And I'm sitting here going, oh my gosh, please stop. Just stop. Please stop. That's not how it works. And this other character is like, I don't want to spoil it, but basically they're like telling her something and she's just not accepting that information. And then she remembers the words from her sister, which is like, when a man tells you how they are, believe them. If you meet somebody and they're like, I don't trust women, believe that they don't trust women, right? And so she remembers that and she pauses and processes it and takes a step back and then finally accepts that information from this character. And I just so appreciate that because I don't think I've ever seen this in a young adult trilogy where like somebody, a friend or the character themselves realize they're being silly. So I just really, really appreciated it. One of the other things I really appreciated it is that there were definitely hints of a love triangle. However, it was never actually a love triangle. Like, I actually really like that. So there was the secondary person that's like, I have a crush on you. And she's like, oh, maybe I like you too, which is a pretty normal reaction. You're like flattered that somebody is attracted to you. So you're like, but maybe I'm attracted to you too. And she definitely does that, but it doesn't take her terribly long to realize like, no, I just kind of really want to be your friend. I love you, but like as a friend. And she communicates that, number one, and then she doesn't continue to lead him on. Now he has trouble accepting it, but it's like, again, it's all very normal reactions. And I'm just like, oh, thank goodness we're being mature about this. And so it was really nice to see that as well. But next, let's just briefly touch on the writing style and structure. Nothing super interesting about the structure. The writing is very easy, very straightforward. Nothing major to report on that front. But that's honestly like really, oh, and diversity, sorry, that was the last one, is there isn't a whole lot of diversity, to be completely honest. And I wish there were more, but we also just didn't have a ton of characters in general. Like I said, we had this core of like 8 characters and then variations on them. So like it just wasn't quite going to work. But I do feel that lack. I understand why it happened. I just do feel the lack. But that is it. Let me know down below if you have read these. Do you like them? Are you interested in them? Of course, please no spoilers. Or if you do want to talk spoilers, go ahead and hit enter a bunch of times and put the spoiler underneath the cut, please. But that's all I got, you guys. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. But that's all I have. So until next time, happy reading, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.